Final Fantasy has provided gamers with some of the most awe-inspiring and unforgettable boss battles, spanning emotional, narrative-driven confrontations to challenging in-game trials. The ensemble of bosses in each installment serves as a proving ground to test players and their understanding of a game's mechanics. But while the majority of bosses tend to be consistent in being either manageable or offering an acceptable challenge, a notable selection of foes occupy a rather unique middle ground. And this middle ground encompasses bosses that, on the surface at least, seem formidable, but would actually be severely hampered by a very specific weakness. In other words, they would possess an Achilles heel. These exploitable weaknesses were often not apparent at first glance. Many bosses of this caliber would be rather deceptive in strength, either due to their general combat prowess or their significance in the narrative or endgame content. As such, their respective vulnerabilities and resultant ease of defeating them would be seen as surprising and somewhat game-breaking. That's why, for today's video, we've decided to zero in on some of these intriguing bosses and their astonishing weaknesses. But to clarify, acquiring the ultimate weapons and/or being overpowered or exploiting the game to streamline battles and make them easy isn't what we're classifying as a weakness. Focus will instead be placed on fundamental weaknesses that meant bosses could be defeated with relative ease, and even when seemingly underpowered according to the game's meta. So strap yourselves in as we dive into 7 powerful bosses with highly exploitable weaknesses, and we're going to start with a curious entry, Ruby Weapon from Final Fantasy VII. In the world of Final Fantasy VII, due to the looming threats of Shinra, Jenova, and Sephiroth, the planet unleashed the weapons. These powerful beasts were of varying difficulties, but Ruby and Emerald would be introduced as verifiable super bosses, and on face value, encounters against them would seem insurmountable. In the many years that have passed, numerous strategies have been introduced to defeat both of them through brute force or smart materia combinations. But Ruby Weapon also possessed an unexpected weakness that could be quite advantageous to players. And this weakness was its susceptibility to paralysis, or the paralyzed status effect. Even though Final Fantasy VII featured numerous status effects, it would be quite easy to breeze through the game without ever using any of them in an offensive nature. And when squaring off against Ruby Weapon in the desert region surrounding the Gold Saucer, it would not have been a front-of-mind strategy, as most powerful bosses were often immune to all negative status effects. Ultimate Weapon and Diamond Weapon, for example, would be immune to the majority of status effects, including paralysis. And it would have therefore been easy to assume, due to its status, that Ruby Weapon would be much the same, not least because it boasted incredibly high defensive stats and devastating offensive capabilities. But with some careful maneuvering, a large stockpile of dazers, and the Hades materia, players could exploit Ruby Weapon's vulnerability to paralysis and disrupt its actions. This would then provide much more breathing room to try and whittle down its hefty 800,000 HP. While this method would be time-consuming, it would serve as a reliable strategy for defeating the otherwise formidable superboss, especially for those seeking the valuable rewards to those who could defeat it. In Final Fantasy XIII, the central antagonists, the fal'Cie, would be defined by their godlike status and divine powers, effectively enabling the rich lifestyle of Cocoon and the lush lands of Pulse. In light of this, it would make sense that most of the fal'Cie bosses faced throughout the game would be pretty strong, and this would relate to both their health pool, their resistances, and their offensive movesets. Bartandalis could cause problems, but the game's final boss, Orphan, would also pose a stern test as its defensive stats were so high it would only take damage when staggered. Orphan would also cast Doom at the start of the battle, leaving players with limited time to wear away at its 3 million HP. However, in what would be an interesting divergence from most other final bosses across the franchise, Orphan would have a very surprising weakness, as it was vulnerable to instant death. Now, it hasn't been flat out confirmed, but this weakness could have been put in place for a lore reason, as Orphan did, in fact, want to die by the party's hand in order to launch its plan. However, even though the vulnerability existed, it did still have some resistance. To actually take full advantage, the best method would be to use Vanille's full ATB skill Death, which had the potential to instantly kill foes. Going this route would certainly not be without risk, however, as Death would only have a 1% chance of inflicting the instant KO, and thus could take several attempts to have it land. But it would be possible to increase the probability by landing other negative status ailments on Orphan between each casting of Temporal Hollow, which would relieve him of those negative status effects. This meant the strategy was high risk, high reward, as players wouldn't have to deal with having to repeatedly stagger Orphan in order to deal damage. And with the effectiveness of Death not being dependent on things like Crystarium levels or stats, it's a viable strategy for those players who are underleveled. This strategy could also be further elevated by the fact that there was an option to retry the fight over and over again, and this retry would restart from the second phase of the final boss as opposed to the first. Additionally, defeating Orphan in this manner would also allow players much easier access to the 5-star battle rating, which would help with the acquisition of the Superstar achievement. The Four Fiends would make their debut in the very first Final Fantasy game, and they have since become iconic figures. In that initial appearance, the Four Fiends were formidable foes, but one of them was by far the most powerful, and that was Tiamat. This member of the quartet was the first to awaken in the current timeline, but was considered the strongest. But while the narrative and portrayal of this final fiend would appear to solidify Tiamat as the strongest of the four, it could in fact be defeated with a single move. And this was because Tiamat was susceptible to stone and poison. Tiamat could be encountered inside the Flying Fortress, and it would need to be defeated in order to liberate the Wind Crystal. In terms of its overall performance as a boss, Tiamat boasted resistance to fire, lightning, ice, and quake, and would be able to dole out powerful magical attacks. This made it a real step up in terms of challenge compared to previous bosses. But Tiamat's combat prowess would falter in light of its major weaknesses to stone and poison, and because there was no resistances to these respective instant kill effects, players could end the battle with a single skill. And the easiest examples would be using Bane, also known as Scourge, to inflict poison, or Break, which can inflict Petrify. Considering how exploitable this weakness was for a boss that was presented as the pinnacle of the Four Fiends, these vulnerabilities could have been the result of an oversight during the game's initial development. And as if to strengthen that theory, this weakness would eventually be patched out for the Pixel Remaster version. This meant Tiamat was no longer susceptible to either status and would need to be defeated by more conventional means. But if you're playing an older version, including the awesome 20th Anniversary Edition on the PlayStation Portable, then you can still defeat Tiamat with this cheap and effective method. Final Fantasy V's robust and customizable job system encouraged players to try a myriad of combat and support styles, rendering them capable of all sorts of different actions in battle. However, when facing what had the potential to be the game's most powerful boss, the famed mimic Gogo, victory could only be achieved by making use of a surprising weakness. Gogo could be encountered in the sunken walls tower of the merged world, and he would be guarding a crystal shard. During combat, he would communicate with the player, relaying to them that he would mimic their actions. And that's just what he would do, albeit on the scale of a super boss. Physical and magical attacks from the player would see Gogo counter with far more powerful versions of those attacks. These would either deal 9,999 damage or simply deliver an instant KO. Additionally, if the player was able to bring Gogo's health low enough, then he would enter the angered state. This would lead to Gogo doing a triple cast Meteor, which had a high chance of taking out the entire party in a single swoop. But seeing as his sole function was to mimic the party's actions, this meant Gogo had a clear weakness. If the party performed no actions, then there would be nothing to mimic. And after waiting some time with nothing to mimic, Gogo, in a comical twist of events, would instead revere the party for mimicking him. This would see the party awarded victory, and he would grant them the crystal shard that would unlock the mimic job. It should, however, be noted that this strategy would not work against him all the time, as it would not work if Gogo had been angered. Ironically, even though Gogo had the potential to be the most powerful boss in Final Fantasy V, this fight would have the simplest method to victory. But as an honourable mention, it's also worth highlighting Neo Exdeath. This particular foe appeared as the final boss of Final Fantasy V, and it was brutal. However, each part of Neo Exdeath had a particular weakness, For example, using Break Spellblade on the bottom right section would defeat it immediately, and by exploiting these weaknesses, a horrible boss fight could be turned into one that was much more manageable. Final Fantasy VI would include some of the most entertaining and unusual boss battle experiences, with Sabin suplexing the Phantom Train serving as a particular highlight, alongside the recurrent and rather nonsensical encounters with Ultros and Typhon. But the unconventional encounters didn't stop there, as perhaps one of the most interesting boss fights will be against the Magic Master. The Magic Master will be encountered at the top of the Cultist Tower during the party's attempt to obtain the soul of Thamasa, and he would pack a serious punch. Not only would the Magic Master be able to utilize powerful spells and deal hefty damage, but he would also have the ability to alter his weaknesses using barrier change each time he was attacked. And as if to add insult to injury, upon defeat, the Magic Master would cast Ultima. It would seem as though the odds were against the player, as the Magic Master had such a powerful command over magic. But the Magic Master also had some weaknesses that the player could exploit to make the fight more manageable, with some of them being more unusual than others. One way to take advantage of the Magic Master's unique kit would be to cast Berserk. This would enrage the powerful magician, and he'd be so angry that he would resort to physical violence as opposed to using his stockpile of powerful spells, including Barrier Change. This would allow the player to chip away at his HP whilst preparing a Life 3 or re-raise to survive the battle-ending Ultima spell. Another, perhaps less viable strategy would be to defeat the Magic Master by reducing his MP to 0. Spells like Rasp and Osmose would be effective here, but this would be a lengthy process as the Magic Master had 50,000 MP. Perhaps the easiest way would be to just equip the party with Reflect Rings, as this would see the Magic Master essentially defeat himself. But this wasn't so much of a weakness. Instead, Berserk would be the true weakness here, and it could turn a tough fight on paper into one that was something of a cakewalk. The next entry could be quite triggering, as Final Fantasy Tactics had some brutal and punishing boss encounters, and one of the most frustrating boss encounters would see the player square off against Wiegraf and then Belias. What made this encounter notorious was that Wiegraf not only had high defense and powerful Holy Sword attacks, but the battle itself would be positioned within a certain sequence of events, and if the player saved right before the encounter, they would be locked in and able to enhance their team if the setup was suboptimal. Many would find Wiegraf an immovable mountain, and their reputation was more than earned. Many viable strategies do exist to ensure Wiegraf is defeated, and some of them revolve around exploiting a subtle weakness. Now it should be said that this weakness is not quite as crazy as some of the others mentioned within this video, but we wanted to include it due to the sheer harshness of this encounter in general, as any advantage is an advantage. Final Fantasy Tactics featured numerous mechanics, but one of the more subtle ones related to zodiac compatibility. Every unit is given a star sign, and how that star sign reflected against the star sign of a combatant would have an influence on how they performed in combat against each other. In the case of Wiegraf, he was a Virgo, and based on the zodiac compatibility, this meant Ramza would have an advantage as either a Taurus or Capricorn. Having this matchup would grant Ramza an increase in damage dealt and a reduction in damage taken. This advantage could then be pressed by using the Monk class with Squire abilities used to complement. This combination would see Ramza gain access to abilities such as Chakra, Focus and Tailwind, as well as Auto Potion. And when coupled with the Prowess boost, this could turn a very uncomfortable fight into one that was much more comfortable. And that then brings us on to our final entry, the Adamantoise from Final Fantasy XV. Before Final Fantasy XV had even released, it was revealed on Conan that defeating the Adamantoise could take 3 real days, aka 72 hours to defeat.
And then when you actually battle him, it takes 3 real days.
What's the point of all this?
Yeah.
It seriously takes 3 real days?
It takes 72 real-time hours to beat him, like in a row.
Why would someone play this? Why would someone play this game?
It's assumed that this would be a slight exaggeration for comedic effect within the show, but Hajime Tabata had confirmed prior that the boss would take some time to defeat, perhaps even up to 15 hours. If true, this would be akin to the famed Final Fantasy XI super bosses, but it would also have shades of Yzmat from Final Fantasy XII, which could take hours upon hours to defeat. When the game launched, We did indeed learn that the timings had been exaggerated, but the Adamantoise would still take a minimum of 1 hour of consistent play to defeat, not something to be snubbed at. But perhaps due to how much this demanded of players, a weakness was introduced that meant the Adamantoise could be defeated within seconds. Patch 1.06 and 1.07 would see enhancements made to the Ring of the Lucii, specifically its Alternus spell. Before, this spell would only work against weaker enemies, but with the patch, it meant that it would work on much grander foes, including the Adamantoise. If you'd kept up with everything that was happening around Final Fantasy XV, this knowledge was a game changer, as even though successfully casting the Alternus spell would still take a number of attempts due to its reliance on random number generation and the necessity for a full MP bar, this strategy could be used to foil the Adamantoise with minimal fuss. Doing so would grant players to a substantial boost in experience points as well as some other rewards, and it would also be oddly satisfying to use the Ring of the Lucii to defeat a monster that was literally the size of a mountain. And with that, they were 7 brutal bosses that had pretty ridiculous weaknesses. How many of these have you beaten through legitimate means, and how many did you choose to exploit the weakness of? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give us a like and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Adam Aguilar, Agwan, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galcian D. Kujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.